David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and could I begin by thanking the Minister for that contribution. It was helpful, and I was interested in her last comment about any party voting against this bill. To my knowledge, no party is intending to vote against this bill. The Greens certainly are not. The bill does some necessary and useful things. It does strengthen our position in terms of organised crime, money laundering, people trafficking, these sorts of unfortunate activities that none of us could possibly support. So we're quite happy to continue to support the bill. It's an okay bill, but it could be a very much better bill, and it could be more likely to achieve one of its key purposes if this the SOP in my name number 76 was adopted and passed today. So why does I say that? The introduction to the bill, the report back from the committee, says it would enhance our compliance with a number of international conventions, allow ratification of UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption. The fact that we continue to have on our statute books a get-out-of-jail-free card in the Crimes Act, in the sense around legitimating facilitation payments, compromises our ability to stand tall and say, yep, we are compliant with UNCAC, and therefore we can, hand on heart, ratify that document. I think it's worth referencing the SOP in my name is very simple. It would simply insert one extra line into the bill, which would be to repeal section 105C3 of the Crimes Act. What the Crimes Act does in that sense, in the relevant section, it says everyone is liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 7 years who corruptly gives or offers or agrees to give a bribe to a person with intent to influence a foreign public official in respect of any act or omission by that official in their official capacity. In other words, if anybody pays a bribe. 7 years is not a trivial sentence. I think our distaste for corruption at every level is reflected in the fact that that is quite a severe sentence, potentially up to 7 years imprisonment. Unfortunately, subsection 3 of that goes on to say this section does not apply if the act that is alleged to constitute the offence was committed for the sole or primary purpose of ensuring or expediting the performance by a foreign public official of a routine government action and the value of the benefit is small. And otherwise, in everyday language, excluding so-called facilitation payments because they're only little bribes. I appreciate that there's a distinction between paying a bribe to a foreign official in order to secure a contract to export to a country, for example. That is barred, that's banned, nobody allows that, that is illegal. What this does, though, is play around the margins of that to say, okay, having secured my licence to export, I now pay a foreign official a bribe in order to get my goods across the border a little more quickly, to get them off the wharf and into the market a little more swiftly. Let's reverse the situation. Let's imagine that foreign governments had similar provision on their books that allowed foreign business people to come to New Zealand and behave in that way, to slip one of our customs officials a couple of tickets to the rugby and $100 worth of beer, just to make sure that their shipment got first in the queue. We wouldn't tolerate that, and nor should we. So why do we legitimate that sort of action in a foreign country by our business people who are operating internationally? There are several reasons why we ought to remove that provision from the Crimes Act, embed it in this amended legislation, and thereby make it a better piece of legislation, a much more robust one, a much more positive one. It's the right thing to do. New Zealand stands tall as a country that is perceived as having a very, very low level of corruption. That gives us an ability to make moral statements on the public stage, on the world stage. We are perceived as being a country with very low levels of corruption, and I think that's legitimate. I mean, yes, we're not squeaky clean, we're not perfect, but the corruption that exists is at a very low level. Generally, there's a very, very low tolerance for corruption in the New Zealand community and society, in the business community. It gives us our our abhorrence for corruption is, I believe, one of the reasons why New Zealand routinely rates very highly as one of the best countries in the world to do business, because business people can come here and know that they're playing on a more or less level field, that they can't be outbid by somebody paying off a public official to get a resource consent, to get goods across the border more swiftly, to get permission to do something. Mr. Chair.
David Clendon.
This gives us the ability to encourage business to come here to do business and know that the legal landscape is fairly robust and will protect their interests, protect against corruption. So the point's been made already that Transparency International has led the charge on this in terms of encouraging us to remove this exemption. And I acknowledge, as I say, that the Minister was quite right. This amendment bill, this passed, that we're debating today, doesn't add a layer, it doesn't add a negative, but what it doesn't do, it misses an opportunity to take away that blot on our statute book. And I absolutely believe that that section in the Crimes Act is a blot on our statutes. It legitimates illegal activity overseas. And I think to dance around the margin talking about undue benefit is it's relying on semantics, it's simply splitting hairs. The reality is we ought not to be indulging in this sort of behaviour. We certainly ought not to legitimate that behaviour by our business people overseas. Some of the arguments I've heard are to say, well, don't be naive, it's the way of the world. A couple of our key export markets, typically China and India, get named as being countries with a culture of corrupt practice. You've simply got to pay the bribes to get your business done there. It's also true, however, that the governments of those two countries have come out very strongly in their wish to drive that culture out of their business communities, out of daily practice in those countries. New Zealand is held up as a good example of a country that does not tolerate corruption. We go to China, we go to India, and if our exporters engage in this sort of behaviour, where then does it leave their governments in their attempts to drive that corruption, that practice out of their domestic business environment? Hey, New Zealanders do it, it must be okay. We can stand proudly. I believe if we remove this provision, if we make it illegal for our business people to operate in this way, to offer bribes, then as a government, if our business people find they're being disadvantaged, then we can have a government-to-government dialogue saying, hey guys, you need to crank up your act. You need to make sure that our business people are not disadvantaged. Wouldn't it be great if we got the reputation as whistleblowers who would not tolerate corrupt practice? That would be a very strong statement New Zealand could and should make. I confess that it puts our business people in a difficult position, but I believe if we go to market with good quality products, good services, and if we stand on an honest and good ethical base and legitimate that in our legislation, that would be to the advantage of our business of New Zealand Incorporated and our progress as a country economically as well as socially. So the Minister made the point that Australia doesn't have an absolute ban on facilitation payments, and she's right. They haven't yet gone to the point we'd like them to. It's also true that the 2012 UN review of Australians' position in relation to the UNCAC called for the Australians to have a really hard look at that. It implied, and I don't think I'm overselling it here, it sort of implied that the UN sees a dilemma in Australia's continued willingness to accept the payment of facilitation payments by their business people. That just doesn't sit well. It doesn't mesh with Australia's position of having ratified UNCAC. We will face the same dilemma. Why would we want to do that? Why not put ourselves in a very clean position to say, no, we won't tolerate the payment of bribes, be they large or small. We won't tolerate behaviour by our business people overseas that we would not tolerate here. That is a clean and a straightforward and an honest position. It's a principled position, and it's one that I do believe would advance our business interest in the long term. We have the examples of UK and Australia. The UK, the British position is that they will not allow facilitation payments. They will not allow their their people working abroad to engage in that behaviour. The point was made by the Minister, and quite legitimately, about unintentional criminalisation. I do not believe that a business person, a New Zealand business person operating overseas unintentionally paid a bribe. If they handed over some cash thinking, oh, that's the way they do business here, I don't believe that any New Zealand prosecutor, police would be interested in taking that person to task on that. Certainly they might give them some information, they might advise them against that course of practice, but I do not believe that we will criminalise our own if through naivety they commit.